Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Comet Chronograph, which is a brand new microbrand based out of Detroit, and their first ever release, which is now live on Kickstarter. The story of Comet Chronograph is a familiar one, and it starts with the man behind it, Bhavin Patel, and he's an enthusiast who is particularly interested in vintage chronographs. And when he realized that the prices for many of those pieces were getting out of reach of most people, he decided to create an affordable microbrand replicating the style of those 1940s chronos he was so interested in. And the first chronograph is actually an homage to two separate watches. And I have to say that it's also one of the best made dials I've ever run across. Now I believe there are currently 10 different variants that are going to be offered, and there's really something here for everyone. From the more traditional to the more colorful. But before we get to the watch itself, I do want to talk about my experience with this Kickstarter and how it's been different from other Kickstarters I've reviewed. Usually when I review a Kickstarter watch, they wind up asking me if I'm interested a couple of weeks before the Kickstarter actually starts, and sometimes not even then. And while they usually tell me to take as much time as I need, there's always an underlying pressure to do it as quickly as possible, just because they only have so many prototypes and only a limited time frame to get them around to as many reviewers as possible. But with Comet, it's been completely different, and in a good way. They actually asked me way back in March if I was interested in reviewing the watch. And from what I understand, they actually identified all the other reviewers they wanted way back then, just so they could plan ahead and have a prototype made to give to each reviewer just so they wouldn't have to rush. So the one you're seeing here is actually mine now. And another great thing is that they actually got these prepared and shipped out to us at the beginning of July. So I've actually had about a month and a half to really get to know it. Now I know this intro is already getting pretty long, but I really wanted to mention that, even though it doesn't really directly reflect on the watch itself. But I think it does show a level of professionalism as well as organizational skills of the man behind Comet Chronograph, which I do think is vital to the long-term success of a microbrand. But that's enough talking about it. Let's really start to look at the details.
As usual, let's start off with the dimensions. And here, the Comet Chronograph is 41.5mm wide without the crown and about 44.7 width, while lug-to-lug is right around 48.5. And I know some would prefer this to be smaller and maybe even as small as its inspiration, but overall I think it's a good contemporary size here. And it's a size that wears quite well, especially with these really nicely shaped low-hanging lugs on the case. Although I do think lug-to-lug might be just a tad longer than I like, but not a lot. The thickness, however, is a tad tall for a quartz watch at 13.3, but again, it's not too tall, and that is with a nice double-domed crystal that really adds to that vintage aesthetic. And before anyone asks, that crystal is not sapphire, it's K1 mineral with a sapphire coating. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, and kinda not. Double-domed sapphire would be nice here and really preferred, but that would increase the price a bit. And here Comet is really trying to go for an affordable piece, so it's understandable why they went with K1. And speaking of price, we are looking at an early bird Kickstarter of $199, and when those are gone I think it jumps up to $229, which I think is right in line with a lot of Dan Henry's. Now water resistance is 50 meters, and I think we'd all prefer a little more, but there's nothing really wrong with 50 meters, especially on a chronograph. Strap width for the Comet is 22mm, so you have lots of options. And depending on which color you have, you could even choose some of your old diver straps. The case is 3/16 stainless, and it has a very nice brushed finish throughout the watch, while a very clean bezel with a polished finish sits on top. Overall, the case is an homage to a JLC 1940s chrono, with its flowing sloped lugs and just these rectangular pushers. And it's a case shape that I do really like, and one I enjoy looking at least at most angles. Most of the time, I really appreciate its two-tone effect of the polished and brushed parts, especially with these nice flowing curves of both the case and the crystal, with just a slight interruption of that geometry for these square pushers. Not to mention the stepping up effect of the bezel just before it hits the crystal is a really great look, which when you combine that with the distortion of the dial below from the edge of that crystal, really creates a great retro visual look. The only exception to that, and this is a little bit of a nitpick, is when you look at the watch on its left side. And here it just looks really, really tall. as there aren't any pushers or any lugs that creates kind of a gradual step up to the top of the crystal. It's a minor thing, but it is something I noticed. The case back has a nice sunburst effect with the logo right in the center, as well as the vital details along the edge of it. It has a really nice brushed finish that matches the case, and in fact I think the finishing of the whole case itself is rather good. On the right you do have the regular configuration of pushers and the crown, and they happen to be brushed on the top, but also polished on the flat edge just so it stands out a little more. The crown here is a decent size, but it isn't signed, which I think makes it look a little generic. Although this was addressed in the Kickstarter, and Comet has said that they left it blank because watches of that era typically didn't have a signed crown, as well as they thought that putting the Comet logo on a crown that small would be rather futile and kind of hard to read. Yet even with that, I think I would prefer it signed here, even with just a stylized C. Now, this is a quartz chronograph, and specifically it has a Miyota 6S11 movement. So this isn't a mecha quartz, so you're not going to have the instant snapback of the second hand or quite as nice a response from the pushers. But overall, the pusher response here is not bad, and this does have a really nice sweep to it. And I believe this specific movement was chosen as it perfectly matches the design that they were going for. I believe that they looked at some other movements, including some of the mecha quartz, and none of them would quite work with what they wanted to do. And that all leads us to the dial, and is the main reason here that anyone would be willing to pay $200 for this thing. And I would encourage you to go check out their Kickstarter, and you could see an example of how many steps it takes to make a dial like this. And I think this type of dial perfectly matches the domed crystal, to give it just that great vintage look. Although if I had one complaint, I think that there is a lot and maybe too much distortion at the very edges of the dial, which combined with the really small print of the outermost edge of the tachometer makes it almost impossible to read. But let's go back to the dial itself. And as I said, there are going to be 10 different versions of this watch with a whole variety of color schemes. But for whatever reason, I was really attracted to this green and silver version. It's not usually a color scheme I go for, which is maybe why I liked it. One minor complaint I do have is that so far I haven't really seen any real names for the different versions of these watches. And with 10 different versions and all of them being a bit multicolored, it can get a little confusing to specify which one you're talking about. So it's something I would suggest they work on, as well as it gives you an opportunity to maybe come up with some fun and creative names for some of these.
While the case is an homage to that JLC, the dial is an homage to a 1940s Pierce chronograph. And if you're someone that likes a clean, minimalist dial, maybe a little bit of a Bauhaus thing going on, then you might as well just stop the video right here, because this is the exact opposite of that. In fact, I'm not sure if I've ever seen anything more complex. And before we really dive in, I do need to point out that they have changed dial manufacturers for the final production version, supposedly to one that's even better and even more costly than the one here. So just bear that in mind when you take in these macro shots, as this one I think is already fantastic looking up close. So I'm really curious what a better manufacturer is going to do.
But let's start at the center and then work our way out. And this particular one has a circular metallic brushed center. And it's here that you find the Comet logo, as well as the phrase chronograph. And I have to say that I really love the Comet logo here. I'm a bit of a sci-fi nut, and I think it just has that great retro 40s and 50s sci-fi feel to it. Or at the very least, it's kind of like something you'd expect in a Fallout game. Just beyond the logo, we do have the telemeter scale. And that scale is basically used to tell the distance from an event to you based on the speed of sound. Think about how you count the seconds between seeing a flash of lightning and hearing the thunder to tell the distance. And that scale also runs right through the middle of the two subdials. The subdial at the top is for the chronograph minutes elapsed, and the one at the bottom is for running seconds. And they're both in this very pale blue-green color, which is also shared as the outline for the hour indicators that are just beyond that, while the interior of those indicators is in a white coloring. Now, just beyond that, you do have minute indicators, as well as the rest of the subdial, and all of that is actually raised slightly above the center. And the minute indicators here are these very orange teeth, which, as strange as it sounds, is something I really love on this particular dial. That combined with the circular brushed metal kind of reminds me of a saw blade. And that orange color here I think is just perfect. There's not a lot of it, but what's there really just pops and does add a nice contrast with the rest of the dial and acts as a great border to the mint green tachometer. And the tachometer here is really one of the more complicated ones I've ever seen, with 3 separate tracks that run around it, so you can actually track events up to 3 minutes. Although to be honest, most people today don't use it, they just kind of like it for the looks, and here it is taking up a lot of valuable dial real estate. So it might be a little overkill, but I can't complain about it too much because, well, that's really the look they're going for. So the dial winds up being extremely busy and extremely complicated, yet with a very classic looking design. And with a very liberal and vibrant use of color on some versions, I think the Comet Chronograph is going to wind up being a watch that you either love or hate at first glance. I think it all just depends on your personal tastes, and for me, I actually like it. And I think I like it because it's just different than any other watch I've had. But what I really love about it is just how well executed it is. When you look at all these macro shots, all of them just look great. And that finish and just attention to detail also applies to the hands as well, which have a fantastic dark black enamel-like finish that I think looks great against the silver metallic backdrop. The minute and hour hands also have a white lume center, as well as these very fine and pointy long tips. Now at first glance, I think the hands do appear a bit short, even with those really long tips. But when you look at it in more detail, you realize they're not. The hour hand extends to the hour indicators, and the minute hand goes just past those orange teeth. I think they just look short as the actual watch part of the dial itself is just the center of it, while the tachometer section is overly large here. As well as I think they look short compared to the chronograph's second hand, as it's proportioned correctly to take full advantage of the dial. While I did get used to it rather quickly, it is something that bothered me at first, so it might bother you as well. So overall, I think the dial design here is going to be rather subjective, and just trust your first reaction to it. Personally, I think it's really beautiful to look at, and the only complaint I really have with the entire thing is the lume.
And that really won't be a surprise to anyone who's watched this channel before. Now in the Kickstarter, they do point out that this is not really a lume-centric watch, so lume really isn't going to be its strong point. And as you can see, they really didn't put a lot of effort into it here, as it's listed as using a basic Hong Kong luminous. And I can tell you from first-hand experience that it does help a little bit when you walk into a dark room, but this definitely isn't a watch that's going to last you through the night. So after a month of wearing it, I knew it really wasn't going to be very good. Basically, I just wanted to compare it to a Vostok, which I used kind of as a baseline for being just okay. And as you can see here, it's not near as good as that Vostok. Now, they do have a point that this watch really isn't made for lume, but to me, if you're gonna do it, you might as well do it right. Or just use white-looking paint and not even bother with lume. In fact, I don't even think the lume needs to be brighter, but just last longer. I would even like a little bit of lume on the indices of the dial, but if, and let me stress this, only if it wouldn't significantly raise the cost or change the look in any way.
Which finally leads us to the strap. And here it's this very nice black classic style strap that's made from Horween leather out of Chicago. And it's marked as such on the back, well, along with the Comet logo. And I do think the final version will be slightly different than this one, with smaller holes and a smaller needle. The strap starts off at 22mm and it does taper down to 18. And as a nice touch, it does have quick release. I think there's a little bit of a break-in period here, but overall it's a fantastic strap. I only have 2 complaints about the strap. The first is that over the time I've had it, I think there's a little more wear than I'd like on the top of it. But that might be because the black color tends to show it off more. The second is the black color itself, which there's nothing particularly wrong with. It's just there are 3 straps available, this black one and 2 others. But those others are only available on one specific watch each, while the rest of them just get this black strap. Now with dials like these, I think it is hard to choose a good strap to go with it. But I think it should be an option with the Kickstarter rather than just the standard black. Regardless, wearing the watch on that strap, I can say firsthand that it's very comfortable, and even in the hot, humid summer of Texas. I think the watch does look a little tall, at least at certain angles, but it doesn't wear like it. That shallow, flat case back and the lugs I think really help it hug your wrist.
Overall, I like the Comet Chronograph, and I like it for what it is and what they were trying to do with it. They didn't set out to make the best 1940s style chronograph. If they did, it'd have a Swiss mechanical movement, sapphire crystal, maybe a little bit better water resistance, as well as a price tag that was going to be much closer to $1,000 than the $200 we have here. Rather, they set out to make a good watch at an affordable price, as the idea behind the company was to take those classic designs and make them more affordable and more accessible to more people, which in many ways is exactly what Dan Henry does. And with that in mind, I think Comet did an excellent job here. I mean, my only real complaint is the lume, and admittedly, this is a watch that doesn't demand a lot of it. And in terms of comparisons, again, I think you only have to look at Dan Henry, which has really kind of become the standard when it comes to vintage homage chronos these days. And when you do, you kind of see that the specs and the movements and the crystal and the price are all right in line with Dan Henry. Now, if you're someone that needs or wants sapphire in a mechanical movement, this is definitely not going to be your watch. But if the Kickstarter is successful, then it might be something they look at in the future, but it's not going to be anytime soon. The big question I'm left with is how well this Kickstarter is going to turn out, because no matter how much I like it, I'm really not sure how much of a market exists for really vibrant 1940s chronos, but we'll find out in the next month. In the meantime, let me know down below in a comment what you think about the Comet Chronograph, and if you are interested, which versions you might be interested in. Other than the silver-green version, I really like the black and orange, as well as the Captain America one. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.